Welcome to the haunting tale of Black Hollow, a forgotten town where silence is survival and the whisper of the cornfields hides secrets darker than night itself. When Lucas Darnell arrives searching for truth, he uncovers a chilling curse bound by ancient rituals and voices that mimic his own. As the shadows close in and reality unravels, he must confront a terrifying question. Can he break free, or will he become just another lost voice in the fields? Beware. Some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some whispers never stop calling. Are you ready to listen? They warned me before I even crossed into Black Hollow. Never speak near the cornfields at night, the woman at the last gas station said. Just don't. She wouldn't say more. None of them ever did. The road leading into Black Hollow was little more than a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt, flanked on both sides by towering walls of corn. The stalks were unnaturally tall, their leaves brushing against the sides of my car like skeletal fingers. It was early autumn, but the sky had already begun to shift into that heavy slate-gray tone that made everything feel colder than it actually was. The town didn't appear on any map I'd used. Even my GPS had gone dark miles ago, blinking helplessly with a no signal message that had grown increasingly unsettling. I had come to Black Hollow on assignment. My editor wanted local color, some obscure piece about American rural folklore, a break from my usual work chasing down politicians and crime stories, the sort of quiet place where nothing ever really happens, where you could supposedly breathe, escape, rest. But as I pulled into town, I felt none of that. The so-called town square was barely 3 blocks wide, a gas station with boarded-up windows, a diner with a single flickering neon sign reading Maggie's, a post office that looked condemned, and finally, Maple Inn, my temporary home, the only lodging available. The wooden sign above the porch creaked as the wind shifted, the painted letters nearly worn away. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the hollow quiet that seemed to press against the windows of the car like a physical weight. No birds, no bugs, just the low rustling of the corn as the wind swept through it in unsettling waves, like the field itself was breathing. The front door of the Maple Inn creaked open before I even reached it. A woman stood there, thin and brittle like the house had birthed her. Late 60s, maybe early 70s, deep wrinkles framed sharp, watchful eyes. "You must be Mr. Darnell," she rasped, as if she'd been expecting me for years. "Room's ready." "Yes, thank you," I managed, extending my ID as she requested. Her name was Marcia Kendrick. She didn't smile as she took my ID, her fingers cold against mine. "You here to write about our town?" "Folklore, traditions," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Unusual customs." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Some things best stay buried, Mr. Darnell." I forced a chuckle, but her eyes didn't waver. "Just be careful," she added, handing back my ID, "especially after dark." I nodded, not sure what else to say, and followed her down a narrow, creaky hallway that smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling strips like parchment trying to escape the walls. "Room 3, she said, unlocking the door with a brass key that felt absurdly heavy for its size. "Bathroom's at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7. Don't wander outside after sundown." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Her gaze hardened. "You heard me." The door closed behind her before I could ask anything more. The room was small, but functional. A narrow bed with a faded quilt. A desk, ancient and slightly lopsided. A single lamp with a cracked shade. But it was the window that drew my eye. A wide bay window facing directly out toward the cornfields. The fields were so close, closer than I expected. The wind was picking up again, sending ripples through the stalks like ocean waves under moonlight. I stared for a long moment, unease settling into my stomach like lead. The way the corn swayed didn't feel random. It felt intentional, rhythmic, like breathing. I drew the curtains shut, but even that felt insufficient. By nightfall, the silence had grown thick and oppressive. I tried to read, but every creak of the floorboards, every distant sigh of wind, drew my attention back to the window. And then, around midnight, I heard it for the first time, A whisper, faint, so faint that for a moment I thought it was the wind again. But it wasn't. It was my name. Lucas. I froze. The voice was barely audible, carried on the breeze, distant and yet impossibly close. I sat up straight, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains fluttered slightly as a cool draft slipped through the edges of the old wooden window frame. Lucas! Help! My skin prickled. I glanced at the window but dared not open it. I told myself it was a dream. Fatigue, jet lag, nerves, anything but what it sounded like. I checked my phone. No signal. No calls. The screen glowed briefly before shutting itself off again. Useless. I closed my eyes and forced my breathing to slow. Whatever it was, I didn't want to acknowledge it. Not tonight. When I finally drifted into sleep, I dreamt of the cornfields. I was standing in the middle of them, tall stalks on every side. The sky, a swirling mass of gray and black above me. The wind whispered through the leaves, but the whispers turned into voices. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Repeating my name, calling me deeper. I woke just before dawn, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to break free. The whispers still echoed faintly in my ears, even as the room stood silent around me. Gray light seeped through the thin curtains, illuminating the worn wallpaper and casting long shadows across the floorboards. For a moment, I wasn't entirely certain whether I was awake or still trapped within that nightmare. It took me a full minute to steady my breathing. When I finally rose from the bed, my legs were trembling. I opened the curtains with hesitant fingers, half expecting to see someone or something standing among the stalks, watching. But the fields looked as they always did, gently swaying beneath the morning breeze, their endless rows vanishing into the horizon like the ribs of some sleeping leviathan. It was too quiet again. Oppressively so. Downstairs, the Maple Inn was still as empty as when I'd arrived. The old clock above the reception desk ticked loudly in the silence. I found Marcia Kendrick in the kitchen, her back to me, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs. "You didn't sleep well." It wasn't a question. "No," I admitted, clearing my throat. "The wind kept me up." Marcia turned, handing me one of the mugs. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she knew more than she was letting on. Not the wind. Her voice was almost a whisper, like speaking any louder might invite something inside. I stared at her, waiting for more. She didn't offer any. Instead, she placed a plate of pale scrambled eggs and toast on the table and sat across from me, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked after a long pause. The way she said them sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, carefully choosing my words. "I thought I heard something outside my window." Marcia's expression darkened. "Don't respond, no matter what you hear. That's how they find you." Her tone was matter-of-fact, like she was reciting a rule everyone here lived by. I forced a nervous laugh, hoping to break the tension. "Find me? Who? Are you saying the fields are haunted or something?" But Marcia didn't smile. She didn't even blink. "I'm saying nothing, Mr. Darnell. Just don't speak to them. Ever." Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the early light shimmered off the restless cornfields. The way she stared at them, like watching a predator circle just beyond reach, made my skin crawl. Before I could press her further, a sudden knock interrupted us. I turned to see an elderly man standing at the doorway, thin and hunched with age, his pale hands gripping the frame for balance. His eyes were sharp, though. Too sharp. "Bill," Marcia greeted him softly. The man nodded politely before turning to me. "You're the reporter," he said. Again, not a question. "Lucas Darnell," I replied, extending a hand he didn't take. "I'm just here to write a piece about local folklore." "Folklore," Bill repeated, almost like tasting the word, before giving a short, humorless chuckle. "You came to the right place." He stepped inside, his boots tapping softly against the worn floorboards. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, though he was already lowering himself into the chair across from me. "Of course not." Bill studied me for a few moments with a strange mixture of curiosity and pity. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You heard them last night, didn't you?" I swallowed. "I might have." He nodded slowly, as though confirming something to himself. "You're not the first, you know." The way he said it unsettled me more than I cared to admit. "I don't understand," I said. "What exactly am I hearing out there?" Bill's lips tightened. He glanced briefly at Marcia, who gave a subtle shake of her head as though warning him not to continue. But Bill pressed on. "We call them the listeners," he whispered. "They've been here longer than this town. Longer than any of us." My throat went dry. "They hear everything. And once they hear you, once you answer, they don't forget." He paused again, glancing toward the front window as though checking to make sure nothing was watching. "That's why we have the rule. We don't talk near the fields. Not after sundown." The air in the room grew heavier. Even the ticking clock seemed louder now. I wanted to dismiss it as backwoods superstition, small-town hysteria, but the look in Bill's eyes wasn't that of a man feeding local ghost stories to gullible visitors. He was afraid. "Have people disappeared?" I asked cautiously. Bill looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Yes. Some never came back. Some came back different." My stomach twisted. "Different how?" Bill's hands trembled slightly as he rubbed his fingers together nervously. "They don't sound like themselves anymore," he said. "Sometimes it's their voice. Other times it's their eyes. You look at them and you know something else is looking back." Marcia finally cut in, her voice sharp. "Enough, Bill." Bill sighed, leaning back in his chair. "He has a right to know." "No," Marcia replied firmly, eyes locking with mine. "He has a right to leave." The room fell silent again. The only sound was the soft rustle of wind outside and the distant creaking of the old building, settling into itself. I stared at both of them, unsure whether I was sitting across from lunatics or survivors. But the unease that had followed me since arriving in Black Hollow only deepened. Later that afternoon, as I walked through the nearly deserted town square, I couldn't shake their words from my head. The fields watched. The listeners waited. And night was coming again. The next morning arrived with a brittle gray light filtering through the town like smoke. Black Hollow seemed even smaller in daylight, its buildings weathered and bent like old men leaning on canes. The air carried a faint metallic taste, sharp and sour, like something rotten beneath the surface that no one dared to mention aloud. I hadn't slept. Not really. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers again. Soft, distant, persistent. They weren't just voices anymore. They were my voice, repeating itself back to me like an echo trapped in a loop that never ended. I needed answers. The diner. Maggie sat like a lone beacon at the end of the main street. The neon sign buzzed faintly as I pushed open the door, the bell above giving a hollow jingle. Inside, the place was almost empty. A couple of locals sat in silence, stirring their coffee as though afraid to draw attention to themselves. Their eyes lifted briefly to meet mine, then quickly dropped, like they regretted even acknowledging my presence. The woman behind the counter smiled politely but without warmth. "Morning. Coffee?" I nodded. "Please." She poured from a half-empty pot, the dark liquid steaming as it filled my chipped mug. "You're not from around here," she said, more as observation than curiosity. "No, ma'am. Lucas Darnell," I introduced myself. "I'm writing a story." Her smile faded slightly at that. "About Black Hollow?" she asked carefully. "About the town's history. Its traditions." She lowered her gaze to the coffee pot and wiped her hands on a faded apron. "There's not much here worth writing about." "That's not what I heard." I leaned in slightly. "Bill said otherwise." Her head snapped up. "You spoke to Bill?" "Yes." For a moment, something flickered behind her eyes. A flash of fear, or maybe pity. "He should know better," she muttered under her breath. "Talking too much only draws them closer." "The listeners," I said quietly. Her hands froze mid-wipe, and she glanced toward the windows as if expecting to see someone, or something, peering inside. "You shouldn't say their name," the whisper barely escaped her lips. I wanted to press further, but the weight in her voice warned me not to. I was beginning to understand the town's unspoken law. Questions were dangerous, answers even more so. As I sat nursing my coffee, trying to piece together what little I knew, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The screen lit up. No caller ID. I frowned. Cell service had been spotty since I'd arrived, but somehow this call was coming through. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello? At first, nothing but static. Then, a voice. Lucas! I froze, heart pounding. The voice was faint but familiar. Too familiar. It was my own. Lucas. Help. My skin crawled as the line went dead. I stared at the phone, the screen returning to black. The waitress watched me from behind the counter, her face pale. You shouldn't answer unknown calls here, she said softly. Not anymore. I left the diner, unsettled, my mind spiraling. Every encounter in this town only deepened the sense that I was being slowly pulled into something far beyond my understanding. And yet, a twisted part of me couldn't stop digging. I spent the rest of the afternoon at the town library, a crumbling brick building that seemed abandoned from the outside. Inside, however, it was surprisingly intact. Dusty, yes, but well-maintained, as though someone still cared for it despite the town's indifference. The records section was small. Most of the historical documents had long since been removed or misplaced, but tucked away behind several outdated census files, I found a folder marked simply, Auto Recordings, Archive 5752005. Shouldn't have been accessible. The librarian was nowhere in sight. I slipped the folder out and carried it to one of the old listening stations. Bulky tape decks that looked like they hadn't been used in years. I loaded the first tape, my fingers trembling slightly. The recording began with a man's voice, shaky, frightened. If anyone ever finds this, it means I'm gone. Static crackled, then continued. They listen. They always listen. But it's not enough to be silent. Once you respond, once you acknowledge them, they know you, they remember you. The voice belonged to a man named Richard Keene, a name I didn't recognize. His words were fragmented, broken by sobs and heavy breathing. We thought the ritual would hold. We were wrong. We let one speak. That's how it started. That's how it always starts. The tape ended with a high-pitched screech that made my ears ring. I sat there for several minutes trying to process what I just heard. This wasn't some backwoods superstition. These were accounts, first-hand testimonies, from people who had lived through something still alive out there. When I finally stepped out of the library, dusk had settled over Black Hollow. The wind had picked up again, and with it came the now familiar rustling of the cornfields. The fields always seemed closer at night. As I walked back toward Maple Inn, I tried to ignore the growing weight in my chest, but then, without realizing it, I did exactly what I had been warned never to do. I spoke. Is anyone out there? I called into the wind, my voice shaky but loud enough to carry. The rustling stopped. Dead silence fell as though the entire town was holding its breath. And then, barely audible, a whisper came back, mimicking my exact tone. Is anyone out there? My blood ran cold. The cold night air bit into my skin as I stood frozen at the edge of the cornfield. The whisper had come back, an exact mimic of my own voice, warped and dripping with something otherworldly. I wanted to retreat, to run back to the safety of my room, but some part of me, a curious and reckless part, kept me rooted in place. I swallowed the lump in my throat and took a hesitant step forward. The cornstalks towered over me, their shadows stretching long and menacing under the faint glow of the moon. The rustling stopped completely, as if the field itself held its breath, waiting. Suddenly, I felt it. Eyes watching. Not just any eyes, but eyes that pierced through the dark, cold and unblinking. I turned sharply, but the endless rows of corn stretched into impenetrable blackness. No figure emerged, no movement betrayed their presence. I heard a soft shuffle behind me and spun back, heart thudding wildly. Nothing but the whispering wind. but the sense of being stalked was undeniable. With each step I took away from the field, the whispers grew louder. Not voices, but a symphony of murmurs echoing in my mind. There were fragments of sentences, half-remembered names, pleading and accusatory cries. I stumbled back toward town, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. The streets were empty, houses shuttered as if the entire community had withdrawn into their own shells, bracing for something inevitable. Maggie's diner was still open, the neon sign flickering dimly. Inside, Bill was sitting alone at the counter, his face pale but resolute. He looked up as I entered. "You did it," he said simply. I sank into the booth opposite him. "I spoke," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Bill nodded. "It's the first violation. Once you speak, you're marked." "Marked for what?" "To be hunted." His words sent a chill crawling up my spine. For years, Bill had been the keeper of these stories, the reluctant chronicler of the town's darkest secret. Now, I was part of that story. He slid an old cassette tape across the table toward me. "Listen to this. It'll tell you what happens next." Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed, the tape recorder humming softly. The voice on the tape was raspy and urgent. We thought silence would protect us. But they listen for anything, any words spoken near the fields at night. Once they hear, they know your voice. They imitate it. They lure you deeper into the corn until there's no way out. I shuddered. The tape continued with a chilling account of neighbors disappearing, returning changed, vacant-eyed shadows of themselves. Suddenly the tape hissed and sputtered before the final message came through, almost a whisper itself. "Don't trust your own voice." As I sat there, the room seemed to close in around me. The wind outside picked up again, carrying the faintest echo of a voice calling my name. It wasn't the tape anymore. It was real. My phone buzzed, breaking the oppressive silence. A message from an unknown number. "We're watching." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Every instinct screamed for me to leave this place, but I had come too far. The night stretched on, thick with shadows and whispers. I lay awake, wondering how many had fallen into the same trap, marked by their own voice, hunted by something no one could see but everyone feared. Black Hollow was no longer just a story. It was a prison, and I was trapped inside. And now, I was one of them. Awake now, I was one of them. Of Black Hollow's silence pressed harder against me with each passing day. It wasn't just the quiet anymore. It was the absence of normal sounds. The chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals, anything that could remind me this place was alive. Instead, the cornfields dominated every sense, their endless stalks stretching like sentinels, watching, waiting. Sleep became a stranger, night after night. The whispers invaded my dreams, turning them into mazes of shadow and sound. Voices repeated my name, but never just once. Always a chorus, overlapping, echoing, twisting into something unrecognizable yet intimately familiar. I would wake, gasping, my sheets tangled and sweat-soaked. During the days, I found myself drifting toward the outskirts of town more often, as if trying to peer beyond the curtain of maze that enveloped the horizon. One afternoon, I wandered to the old library, its faded bricks heavy with dust and secrets. Inside, I met Bill again, his presence a small comfort in this town of ghosts. He sat hunched over an ancient ledger, flipping pages with trembling fingers. "Looking for answers?" he asked without looking up. "I need to understand," I said. "Why the rules? Who are the listeners really?" He sighed, finally meeting my gaze. "They've been here longer than any of us. Before the town was founded, before the first corn was planted." Bill pulled a small, worn notebook from beneath the ledger, handing it to me. "This belonged to someone who didn't make it out. It's the only record we have of what happens when you break the silence." I opened it carefully. The pages were filled with shaky handwriting, detailing strange rituals, warnings, and an ominous countdown tied to the cycles of the moon. The last entry was a hurried scrawl. "They know." I can hear my voice echoing in the fields. "They're coming." I closed the notebook, heart pounding. Why hasn't anyone left? Why do people stay? Bill's eyes darkened. Because some of us are bound here. By blood, by promise, or by fear. The listeners don't just hunt you, they claim you. Later that evening, I found myself standing at the edge of the cornfield again. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. The air was thick with a stillness that felt unnatural. Then, without warning, the stalks began to sway, not with the wind, but with an eerie, synchronized motion. A low hum rose from the field, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. I took a step back, heart racing. Suddenly, a small figure darted from between the rows, an 8-year-old boy, his wide eyes shining with a mix of fear and defiance. He clutched a crude drawing tightly in his hands. He didn't speak, instead he pressed the paper into my palm and vanished before I could ask a single question. The drawing was unsettling. Tall, thin silhouettes with elongated limbs standing amidst the waving corn, their faces blurred and distorted. Beneath them, a jagged circle surrounded by cryptic symbols. That night, the room seemed to pulse with energy. Shadows twisted on the walls, flickering like flames. I lay awake, clutching the drawing, as whispers filled the darkness, voices that weren't just outside but inside my very mind. The phone rang at 3:33 a.m. I answered without hesitation, breathing, heavy, ragged. Then silence, then a whisper, "Come closer." I dropped the phone, heart pounding, the room spinning. The boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred until I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. I was no longer just an observer, I was the hunted. The next few days slipped past in a haze of exhaustion and mounting dread. The line between reality and nightmare blurred so completely that I sometimes caught myself staring at nothing, my mind replaying fragments of the whispers that haunted my every moment. The drawing the boy had given me sat folded in my pocket, its crumpled edges pressing a constant reminder against my thigh. I didn't dare unfold it in daylight. Something about the fragile paper felt sacred, a warning etched in every shaky line. At the diner, Bill grew quieter. His usual cautious optimism dimmed, replaced by a weary acceptance that chilled me. The town's shadows stretched longer than before, and even Maggie, the waitress, seemed to shrink into herself, her smiles forced and eyes hollow. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky blood red, I returned to the library, desperate for answers. I rifled through the ancient ledgers and brittle tomes, searching for any record that might explain the relentless grip the listeners had on this place. In the dim back room, behind a false panel in the wall, I discovered a hidden compartment containing a brittle journal bound in faded leather. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, penned by someone clearly afraid. The voice from the tape I had heard, his entries described a relentless torment, the struggle to keep silent, and the terror of hearing his own voice twisted and used against him by unseen forces lurking in the corn. I read the pages with growing unease. One passage chilled me to the bone. They mimic us. They wear our voices like masks. They call out to draw us close, closer, until there is no turning back. We become echoes in the fields, whispers forever trapped. The weight of those words settled heavily on my shoulders. That night, sleep was a cruel stranger. Shadows lengthened in my room, curling and twisting into shapes that defied logic. I felt them watching, the unseen eyes that had haunted me since arrival. The rustling of the corn was no longer just wind. It was a symphony of breathless voices, chanting and calling my name. At precisely 3:33 a.m., the phone rang again. The ringtone cracked like static, slicing through the silence. I answered before I could think. A ragged breath, then my own voice echoed back, distorted and distant. "Come closer." I slammed the phone down, heart pounding so fiercely I feared it might burst. The walls seemed to close in, and a cold sweat slicked my skin. I didn't sleep again that night. Days later, a creeping realization settled over me. The fields were growing. The corn encroached farther each day, swallowing the edges of Black Hollow inch by inch. Like a living thing expanding its territory, I found myself trapped in a maze, not just of stalks, but of doubt and fear. The townspeople's silence felt like a conspiracy, their avoidance of any mention of the listeners a barrier keeping me on the outside. One afternoon, wandering near the boundary of the fields, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the last row of corn, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow, its face hidden but somehow familiar. It watched me with an unsettling stillness. I froze, heart hammering before turning and fleeing back toward town. That night, as I lay trembling under the thin sheets of my room, the whisper came again, closer this time, like breath on my neck. "You cannot hide." I rolled over, eyes wide and searching the darkness. There was nothing there, only the persistent rustling beyond the window. My resolve was crumbling. I was no longer an observer in Black Hollow. I was the prey, and the hunt had only just begun. The moment I crossed the threshold into that old church basement, the air changed. It thickened, heavy with the scent of damp stone and ancient secrets long buried beneath decades of dust and silence. The single bare bulb overhead cast flickering shadows, dancing like restless spirits along the cracked walls. I swallowed hard, my breath uneven in the cold gloom. Somewhere deep inside, a voice told me to turn back, to leave this forgotten place to its ghosts. But the other voice, the one driven by desperation and a gnawing need for truth, pushed me forward. The journal lay open on a rough wooden table, its pages yellowed and brittle. The faded ink spoke of rites and bindings, of voices trapped in endless cycles, and of the ritual that was never truly finished. The offer had been the town's last guardian, a man who tried to stop the encroaching darkness, but his words betrayed despair, the knowledge that what he fought had already slipped through the cracks. As I traced the lines with trembling fingers, I heard it, a low murmur curling up from the very stones beneath me. A chorus of whispers, too soft to decipher but unmistakably present. I blinked, heart skipping. Had the walls begun to speak? The echoes pulled me toward the far corner, where a faded mural depicted a circle of figures entwined in shadow and light. Beneath them, the scrawled words, "No one leaves who hears the call." My fingers brushed against a loose stone. It shifted, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside lay a small tape recorder, dust-coated but intact. I pressed play. A crackling voice filled the room, Father Hewitt's. Caught in a moment of frantic urgency. "We bind them here, but the seal weakens." The listeners' voices grow louder. They reach beyond the fields, into our minds. "We must resist, or be consumed." Static hissed, then silence. The tape ended too soon, leaving an unbearable stillness behind. I leaned back, trying to steady the whirlwind in my thoughts. The ritual, this binding, was failing. The listeners were breaking free, and I was standing at the edge of the collapse. Suddenly, a distant thud echoed from above. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. I froze. Then the basement door creaked, and Bill's weary face appeared in the dim light. "You shouldn't be down here alone," he said quietly, concern etched deep into his lined features. "I had to see," I replied, "to know what we're really up against." He nodded slowly. "You're deeper in this than any of us were. Be careful, Lucas. The listeners don't just want silence. They want you." His words settled over me like a shroud. That night, back in my room, the boundaries of reality began to blur. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in time with my ragged heartbeat. Shadows gathered, forming shapes just beyond the corner of my eye. The whispers invaded again. This time, inside my head, they tangled with my thoughts, twisting memories until I wasn't sure what was real. Images flashed behind my eyelids, a child's laughter echoing through empty fields, A dark figure watching silently, a mother's scream swallowed by the night. I gasped awake, clutching the faded drawing the boy had given me, the jagged circle. The symbol of the ritual, etched in bold lines across the paper, pulsed faintly in the moonlight. I felt a presence behind me, cold and watching. Turning slowly, I saw nothing but shadows, but I knew they were there, the listeners. The next morning, Bill handed me a weathered folder stamped with the seal of the State Mental Health Records Center. Inside were files marked Project Hollow Veil, a classified effort to contain the phenomena plaguing Black Hollow. Patients reported hearing voices, seeing doppelgangers, losing chunks of time, all tied to exposure near the cornfields. Some had vanished without a trace. The documents painted a grim picture. This wasn't folklore or superstition. It was a nightmare carefully hidden in official records. I stared at the photos, blurred figures lurking in grainy surveillance footage, maps marking expansion of the cornfields, detailed accounts of failed exorcisms and containment rituals, everything connected. The ritual had bound the listeners, but only temporarily, and the cycle was breaking. As I left Bill's house that afternoon, the sky hung low and heavy, the wind stirring the corn with sinister rhythm. The fields were closing in, and so was the past. The walls of my room seemed to breathe with a life of their own as night draped its dark cloak over Black Hollow. The faint rustle of the cornfields, ever present, grew louder, filling every crevice of the silent town. Shadows lengthened, curling in the corners, as if watching. I lay awake, muscles tense, listening for the whispers that had become my constant companion. They came first as soft murmurs, like distant voices carried on the wind, indistinct and almost comforting in their familiarity. But soon they twisted into something darker, sharp fragments of my own voice echoing through the silence, calling me, taunting me, pulling me deeper. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the noise, but the whispers were inside my head now, pressing against my sanity. Images flickered behind my eyelids, a twisted ritual circle painted on cold stone, faces half seen in the darkness, a child's desperate cry swallowed by the night. When I opened my eyes, the room was different. The peeling wallpaper shimmered, the air thickened, the walls seemed to close in, narrowing my world to the bed and the window looking out to the fields. Through the glass, the corn swayed unnaturally, casting shadows that danced like living things. A voice, mine but not, whispered from the shadows, "You belong here." I scrambled up, heart hammering, every instinct screaming to flee, but the door was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of stone. I was trapped. Days blurred into one another, time lost meaning. The whispers grew into voices, the voices into screams. Sleep became impossible. Every waking moment was a battle against the growing madness clawing at my mind. In moments of clarity, I remembered the files Bill had given me. Project Hollow Veil. Government attempts to contain the supernatural that had infiltrated Black Hollow. Experiments, failures, lives erased. I found strength in the journal entries of Father Hewitt, whose final words spoke of a failed ritual and a binding never complete. The listeners were breaking free, feeding on the voices of the living, consuming their identities until only empty shells remained. One night, as the clock struck 3:33 a.m., the phone rang again. I answered, breathless. "Welcome home," the voice said, a chilling echo of my own. The line went dead. Suddenly, the room flooded with light, and I was no longer alone. Figures emerged from the walls, pale and elongated, their faces blurred like broken mirrors. The listeners. They reached for me with hands like shadows, voices blending into a maddening chorus. "You can never leave," they chanted. I fought, screamed, but their grip was inevitable. As darkness swallowed me, I realized the truth I had tried to deny. I was never meant to escape Black Hollow. The ritual had bound me here long ago, before I even knew my own name. My past, my memories, all manipulated to keep me trapped in this endless cycle. The fields had grown, swallowing the town inch by inch, and with each expansion another soul was claimed, and now I was one of them. The silence inside the ancient basement was suffocating. Each breath I took echoed off the cold stone walls, mingling with the dust motes that floated lazily in the beam of my flashlight. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of decay and forgotten memories, as if the very foundation of the building held the weight of secrets too dark to speak aloud. I had returned, drawn back by the fragments of truth buried in the journal and tapes. Fragments that teased a reality far more twisted than I had ever imagined. The deeper I descended into the shadows of Black Hollow's past, the more I realized that the horror was not simply outside in the fields, but hidden beneath everything I thought I knew. At the far end of the cellar, beneath a crumbling altar, I discovered a trapdoor, cleverly concealed beneath layers of dirt and debris. My heart hammered as I pried it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward into a deeper darkness. The faintest glimmer of light flickered below, candlelight dancing on stone walls, etched with symbols that made my skin crawl. The air grew colder as I descended, the whispers rising again, more insistent, more desperate. I could almost make out words, snatches of prayers, curses, pleas for mercy, in ancient language half forgotten but still alive in the shadows. At the bottom, I found a chamber, its walls covered in faded murals depicting a ritual I had only glimpsed before in nightmare. Figures encircled a smaller figure bound to a stone slab, eyes closed in eternal sleep. The scene pulsed with a terrible energy, as if the story was still unfolding, frozen in time. And then I saw it. My own face, etched into the mural, twisted in agony. My breath caught. This wasn't just a warning. It was a confession. I was the sacrifice. The ritual, long thought to have saved the town, had only shifted the curse. They had taken me, kidnapped me as a child, erased my memories, bound me in silence. The listeners weren't just creatures of the field, they were bound to me, and I to them. My legs trembled as a sudden noise broke the silence. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy, echoed from above. I recognized him instantly. Bill. He was coming. When he appeared, his face was drawn and pale, eyes haunted by knowledge too heavy to bear. "I'm sorry you had to see this," he whispered. "Most never find the truth before it's too late." I looked at him, confusion and anger warring inside me. "I keep me here. Why let me live in ignorance?" Bill sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. "Because you are the key and the lock. Without you, the cycle breaks, the listeners grow stronger." A sudden chill swept through the chamber. Shadows pooled and thickened, twisting into forms barely human. The listeners had followed me here, crossing the threshold of their domain. I braced myself as they approached, their distorted faces a blur of darkness and light. "Run," Bill urged, grabbing my arm. "There's only one way out." Together we fled upward, retracing the winding stairs. The whispers pursued us, voices melding into a cacophony of despair. Bursting through the trapdoor, we collapsed into the basement, gasping for air. But the weight of the revelation settled on me like a stone. I was not just a victim. I was part of the curse itself, and the past I had tried to forget was now my prison. The night swallowed us whole as we burst out of the basement, gasping in the cool, bitter air. The walls of the old church groaned behind us, as if mourning the secrets we had unearthed. Secrets that should have stayed buried forever. But Black Hollow had other plans. The town was alive, and it knew we were unraveling the threads that held its curse together. Bill dragged me down a narrow alley, the cornfields looming on either side like silent sentinels, their rustling leaves whispering in a language older than time. I could feel the listeners closing in, their presence a cold wave pressing against my skin, tightening with every step. "We have to keep moving," Bill muttered, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "They can't be allowed to catch you. Not now." My legs burned with exhaustion, but fear lent me wings. I stumbled forward, every fiber of my being screaming that if I stopped I'd be swallowed whole, lost forever in a chorus of stolen voices. We reached the edge of town where the cornfield stretched endlessly, the horizon blurring between earth and sky. Bill stopped abruptly, pulling me into the shelter of an old rusted shed, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring into the night. "We're not safe anywhere here," he whispered, "but this might buy us some time." I sank against the cold wood, heart pounding so fiercely I thought it might crack my ribs. The whispers drifted again, distant but growing louder, voices shifting between desperate pleas and mocking laughter. Bill pulled a crumpled map from his jacket, faded and frayed, marked with symbols and annotations I couldn't decipher. "There's a place," he said. "An old safe house outside the town limits. It's the only spot where the listener's hold weakens. A thin veil of protection left by the original ritual." Hope flickered, fragile but real. "We have to get there," I said, pushing myself up. Bill nodded grimly. "But it won't be easy. The fields are alive. They'll try to turn you back, to make you forget." We slipped out into the open, the corn swaying eerily in the moonlight, their rustling growing louder, like a storm without rain. The night air was thick with tension, and I kept my gaze fixed on the dark horizon, willing my legs to move faster. Then, from the shadows between the stalks, figures began to emerge, thin, elongated shapes that seemed woven from darkness itself. Their faces were smudged blurs, eyes shining like distant stars, voices, a chorus of whispered echoes that seemed to twist and warp with every breath. The listeners, they circled us, closing the gap with unnatural speed. I could hear their voices mimicking mine, taunting, beckoning, promising safety if only I'd answer. Bill grabbed my arm, pulling me into a run. The ground beneath our feet felt alive, shifting and pulsing as if the earth itself wanted to swallow us whole. The corn bent and swayed, closing ranks behind us to seal the path. Ahead, a narrow dirt road cut through the fields. Our only hope. "Faster!" Bill shouted, dragging me forward. The listeners screamed, voices rising into a deafening crescendo as they lunged from the shadows. I stumbled, falling hard onto the dirt, scraping my palms raw. Panic surged through me like poison. Hands, cold grasping, clutched at my jacket, yanking me back. "No!" I screamed, kicking wildly. Bill yanked me up, throwing me toward the road. We sprinted, lungs burning, feet pounding the cracked earth. Behind us, the listeners recoiled, hissing in frustration as the boundary of the road seemed to repel their dark forms. We didn't stop running until the safe house's weathered porch came into view, its faded white paint peeling under the harsh moonlight. Inside, the air was stale but still, a refuge from the chaos outside. Bill bolted the door behind us, pressing his forehead against the wood. "They'll come," he said softly, "but here their power fades." I sank into a dusty chair, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. The weight of everything pressed down on me, the truth of my past, the ritual that had bound me here, and the creeping realization that escaping Black Hollow might be impossible. But there was no choice. I had to fight. Bill rummaged through an old box, pulling out a handful of papers and photographs, remnants of the town's forgotten history and failed attempts to break the curse. "This," he said, handing me a faded photograph of a group of people standing in the cornfields, faces solemn, eyes hollow, "was taken 50 years ago. Those were the original keepers of the ritual. They sacrificed everything to bind the listeners. But the ritual never ended." Bill paused. My eyes lingered on a young woman in the front row, her gaze piercing, a flicker of recognition stirring in my gut. "Who is she?" Bill hesitated, then whispered, "Your mother." The room spun. Questions surged in my mind like a tidal wave, memories buried deep, pieces that didn't fit until now. "I have to finish this," I said, voice steady despite the storm inside. "I have to break the cycle." Bill nodded, lighting a candle whose flickering flame cast trembling shadows on the cracked walls. "We'll need to prepare. The ritual requires more than just words and symbols. It needs a sacrifice, a willing heart, and the strength to face what's beyond." The listeners were closing in, the past unraveling, and my role becoming terrifyingly clear. I was not just a victim of Black Hollow's curse. I was its final hope, or its ultimate doom. The night settled over Black Hollow like a suffocating shroud, pressing down on everything with the weight of countless unspoken fears. The cornfields that had once seemed merely ominous now loomed like living walls, their shadows swallowing the faint moonlight, turning the world outside into a void. The town itself had retreated into silence, as if holding its breath for the inevitable. Inside the weathered safe house, the air was thick with anticipation and the scent of burning candles. The small room was cluttered with relics of forgotten rituals. Ancient symbols scratched into the wooden floor, faded photographs pinned to the walls, and the worn journal of Father Hewitt lying open on a rickety table. The flickering flame cast twisted shadows that danced like specters, mirroring the turmoil within me. I stared at the circle drawn beneath the candlelight, the very seal that once bound the listeners but now felt fragile and cracked, a tenuous barrier between salvation and oblivion. Bill's voice broke through the silence, low and steady. "This is it, Lucas. The last chance to end the curse. To stop the cycle from consuming any more lives." I nodded, every nerve alight with a mixture of dread and determination. The ritual wasn't just a ceremony. It was a battle, one that demanded sacrifice, resolve, and the willingness to confront the darkness itself. As we prepared, the whispering began again, softer now, almost pleading. Outside, the corn swayed violently, as if agitated by some unseen force. I could feel their presence pressing against the walls, waiting. The first chant escaped my lips hesitantly, a tangle of words learned from fragile notes and fading memories. Bill joined in, his voice a solemn counterpoint that lent strength to the ancient incantation. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air thickening until every breath was a struggle. Shadows peeled away from the corners, coalescing into shapes both terrifying and sorrowful. The listeners had come, not as distant whispers, but as solid presences, their blurred faces twisted in agony and rage. The boundaries of the room blurred, time folding in on itself as visions flooded my mind. Memories that were not mine, but belonged to those lost souls trapped within the fields, trapped within me. Their pain, their fear, their endless longing surged through me, threatening to shatter my sanity, but I held fast. The ritual demanded it. With every word spoken, the symbols on the floor glowed faintly, burning with an otherworldly light that pushed back the darkness inch by inch. The listeners screamed, their voices a cacophony of despair and fury, clawing at the edges of the seal. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in a single breath. The chamber plunged into darkness, save for a solitary beam of pale light that illuminated the circle once more. I felt a presence beside me. Bill, silent and resolute. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows, her face unmistakable. The woman from the faded photograph. My mother. Her eyes held a sorrow that transcended time, a plea for forgiveness and release. "You are not alone," she whispered, reaching out a hand that shimmered like mist. I grasped it, feeling warmth and pain intertwined, a connection spanning the gulf between past and present. The listeners recoiled, their forms unraveling as the seal strengthened, driven by the power of truth and sacrifice. But the battle was not yet over. The final words trembled on my tongue, a vow to break the cycle, to free the souls trapped in endless torment. As I spoke, the room shook violently, the walls cracking as if the very foundation of Black Hollow was rebelling. Light exploded, blinding and pure, washing away the shadows in a tide of redemption. When the glow faded, the room was empty, silent and still. I was alone, but free. Outside, the first light of dawn pierced the horizon, casting golden rays over the cornfields now still and lifeless. The curse was broken, or so I hoped. The dawn was pale and fragile, casting a weak light over Black Hollow's exhausted streets. The cornfields stood still, their restless rustling silenced as if the town itself exhaled after holding its breath for centuries. But beneath the fragile peace, a deeper unease lingered. I stepped outside the safe house, the cool morning air filling my lungs like a tentative promise. The weight that had pressed on my chest for weeks seemed to lift, yet the echo of the ritual's power still hummed faintly beneath my skin. A reminder that some bindings were never truly broken. The town looked different now. Quieter, yes, but hollow in a way that no dawn could mend. Windows were shuttered, doors locked tight, and faces rarely met my gaze. It was as if the residents were caught between relief and lingering fear, trapped by the memory of what had been and the shadow of what might return. I walked toward the edge of the fields, the boundary where the ritual's power had once held the darkness at bay. The stalks swayed gently, lifeless now, but I knew the silence was fragile. Somewhere beneath the soil, beneath the history and pain, something stirred. The listeners had been pushed back, but not destroyed. My footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement as I made my way to the town library, a place of forgotten truths and buried secrets. Inside, Bill was waiting, his face etched with lines of exhaustion and weary hope. "We did it," I said quietly. Bill nodded, eyes distant, for now. He handed me a worn folder filled with reports and photographs, evidence that the cycle was far from over. Missing persons, unexplained phenomena, whispered warnings buried deep in official files. The ritual had only delayed the inevitable. As we pored over the documents, a cold wind swept through the cracked window panes, carrying a faint murmur that made my blood run cold. A whisper on the wind, soft and familiar. Not over. I looked at Bill. He didn't need words to say what we both feared. Black Hollow was a town caught in a loop, a cycle of darkness that no ritual could fully sever. The listeners waited, patient and relentless, for the moment to return, and though we had sealed the breach this time, the price of curiosity had been steep. My reflection caught in the glass of an old photograph, a ghostly double staring back at me with hollow eyes. The truth I had uncovered was a burden I could never lay down. As I stepped back into the fading light, the first birdsong broke through the silence. It was fragile, tentative, a fragile hope amid the shadows. But deep within me, I knew the story was not finished. Black Hollow's whispers would call again, and when they did, I would be ready. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the shadows of Black Hollow. I hope this story kept you on the edge of your seat and stirred your imagination. If you enjoyed diving into the mystery, suspense, and chilling truths with me, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night. Your support means the world and helps keep these tales alive. Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think happened next, or which part gave you goosebumps. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some stories are meant to be whispered, not shouted. See you in the next video.